Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Creating Comics with me, Prentis Rollins. This is the first of 3 episodes in which I'll be dealing with the making of individual comics pages. Not covers or splash pages, just regular old pages broken down into panels, thus showing continuous comics storytelling. It's in these pages where there may or may not be action, but where the artist definitely has to arrange individual panels and compose the imagery within the separate panels, that the comics artist is definitely taxed to the utmost and called upon to exhibit his or her mad skills as a pictorial storyteller. A good comic book artist is not just someone who can draw really well, or draw people in really cool poses, or draw really cool pictures of people fighting. Those things are important, no doubt about it. But just as important, or even more so, is the comic book artist's filmic sense, their cinematographer's eye, their sense of not only how to arrange and compose the elements within a single panel, but also their ability to compose all the panels on a page into a well-designed, pleasing whole. A whole that is easy to understand, that flows seamlessly from panel to panel in a way that leads the reader effortlessly, and ideally makes them forget that they're reading a comic book at all. When you're watching a movie and you're really into the story, it's annoying to be suddenly reminded that you're watching a movie by a sudden bit of awful acting, or a really crappy special effect, or a really annoying, ill-conceived character, or a really jarring continuity error, or any number of other things. Well, it's kind of the same in comics, which, like film, is a variety of sequential storytelling. Nothing annoys me more when I'm reading a comic than to have to go back and reread a page because I just can't tell what's going on. Because it's not clear what order the panel should be read in, or because the pictures are just badly drawn, or because the dialogue bubbles are placed in the wrong places. One moment I'm way into reading this exciting story, and the next moment I've been reminded that I'm reading a comic book, and not a great one at that, because the artist didn't understand how to, or couldn't be bothered to create a well-composed, smoothly flowing page. Personally, when I'm writing and drawing comics, I want to have what's known as a submerged directorial style. That is, I want my directorial style to call so little attention to itself that the reader hardly knows it's there at all. The reader, I'm hoping, will forget, if only for a short time, that he or she is even reading a comic book at all. He or she will be so immersed in the story and will be following it so effortlessly that the medium, in this case comic book art with all its peculiar conventions, will simply be forgotten. Now, we can learn an awful lot about how to draw a comics page well by examining pages that are drawn badly. Think about this. Tremendous strides have been made in psychology and brain science by studying brains that are abnormal, that are afflicted with disease, or tumors, or damage resulting from accidents. In general, we learn how things should work when they're working well by studying how they work when they've gone off the rails in some way. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about what I personally consider to be the single worst comic ever. It's Youngblood issue number 1 from 1990, I think. And it was written and drawn by the always reliable Deadpool creator Rob Liefeld. It was published by a company that was brand new at the time and that Liefeld helped to found, a little company you might have heard of called Image Comics. Now, when I say that Youngblood issue number 1 is, again, in my opinion, the single worst comic ever made, it's not all bad. What I mean by that is this. Think about the bad movies you've seen. Most of them, about 99%, are boring bad. They're action movies or rom-coms that some studio rushed out to meet some perceived or imagined demand. The director was a hack working for a quick buck. The actors phoned in their lame performances. The script was tepid, safe boilerplate. You've forgotten the thing an hour after you've seen it, and you never need to see it again. But a very few bad movies are what I call interesting bad. A movie is interesting bad when the filmmaker thought that he or she was making something that was a work of art, a piece of timeless genius. They poured their heart and soul into this, their visionary masterpiece, tweaked, primped, and prodded it until they thought it was perfect, then released their baby unto an unwitting public only to be greeted with groans or peals of laughter. One of the most famous interesting bad movies was Plan 9 from Outer Space, directed by a fellow named Ed Wood. This movie, one of the last movies to star the then morphine-addicted Bela Lugosi, was so bizarrely, neurotically awful that it amassed legions of fans and a huge cult following. In 1995, there was even a movie about the making of Plan 9 from Outer Space called Ed Wood, directed by Tim Burton and starring none other than Johnny Depp as Ed Wood. Something similar happened in 2003. In that year, a fellow named Tommy Wiseau directed and starred in a movie called The Room. Many consider The Room to be the single worst modern movie, and it too has amassed a veritable army of devoted fans. And yet again, there was a movie about the making of The Room called The Disaster Artist, starring James Franco as Tommy Wiseau. A few other timeless, interesting, bad movies are Manos, The Hands of Fate, Santa Claus Conquers the Martians, Batman and Robin, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger as Mr. Freeze, and Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace, which is about to get its 25th anniversary re-release because absolutely nobody demanded it. Star Wars Episode I is so jaw-droppingly, mind-numbingly poor that a film theoretician could build a career trying to tease out and analyze all of its bizarrely demented features. Bad dialogue, annoying characters, the lack of a protagonist, an impossibly convoluted plot, etc., etc. But, again, it is interesting bad. I guarantee you that in 100 years' time, film watchers will have forgotten Barbie and Oppenheimer, but I bet they're still talking about good old Star Wars Episode I. I would lovingly recommend any of these movies. They're so bad, they're hugely entertaining and stand up to multiple viewings, unlike movies that are boring bad. Getting back to Youngblood Issue 1, like George Lucas, Rob Liefeld had a huge fan base rooting for him and eager to love and praise anything he did. And Youngblood was definitely drawn in Liefeld's instantly recognizable, highly rendered, lovingly detailed style.
Detailed style looked pretty fresh at the time in 1990. It still looks very cool. This is a pretty strong cover showing this team of characters, introducing them. When you look inside, things get a little weird. This is Jeff and Shelley shopping in Washington, D.C. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I know for a fact that there are no glass towers. They're illegal there. You can't have buildings over 10 stories or something. But, so there was no research. Rob Liefeld just didn't care. Now, why is Jeff storming ahead of his girlfriend like this when they're shopping and supposed to be having a romantic day out? And more importantly, why is her dialogue balloon not pointing at her? Instead, it seems to be pointing at this random person here. What's up with that? He just didn't care. And his dialogue bubble, believe it, Shelley. Why is it not pointing at him? Instead, it seems to be pointing or emanating from this random person or this random person. He just didn't care. Why is Jeff's face in this perpetual rictus of action tension? Who looks like that when they're out shopping with their girlfriend? Very strange. All the line work on the faces. Generally, if you add a line, it adds a year to a woman's face, but what are you going to do? Here's another page with Jeff being attacked by this random goon, and Rob decided to draw the same panel from two different points of view. I don't know why. Also, what's going on with Jeff's anatomy underneath his jacket? It's a little hard to imagine, but that's a very rather strange body. The chest in relation to the hips is just not right. Very strange. Nice kind of action lines in the background. Here's another page. Yeah, this is just another example of Rob Liefeld's weird contorted anatomy where you can't really... Here we move on, and it's another character, and he's, just had a one-night stand, and he's saying, no promises, leave your number, you know the way out. Wow, what a prince of a guy. Anyway, without any indication the time has passed, boom, he's suddenly in his full battle regalia. Looks like it would take me about an hour to get this get-up on, especially the painted face. The woman is still in bed, and she's posed in this cheeky way right in front of his crotch. Yeah, and more importantly, Jeff's girlfriend on the right is identical with the mother of another character. These are two different characters, but it's the same woman, the exact same person.
I'd highly recommend getting your hands on an old copy of Youngblood issue 1. Again, when I say it's the single worst comic ever, I mean that in a loving way. It's fun and very much a child of the freewheeling 90s that spawned it. But it's so full of mistakes and little weirdnesses, made all the more strange by the fact that Rob Liefeld clearly poured his heart and soul into it. It's one for the ages, but for all the wrong reasons. Not long ago, I met this guy at Troopers, a monthly event in London where people in the comics biz get together at a pub to chat. He's Neil Gibson, publisher of Twisted Comics, a great company devoted to horror and sci-fi comics. You can learn all about Twisted Comics here. Neil is known for Twisted Dark, a collection of ghastly horror tales, and The Theory, a collection of sci-fi stories, each of which ends with one of Neil's signature twists. I told Neil that I really loved The Theory and that I'd love to illustrate one of the stories for volume number 2. Neil gave me the 20-page story From the Moment She First Saw Him. This is one of those challenging stories in which there's no real action, just dialogue and a few changes of scenery. It's one of those times you're glad you've got a copy of Wally Wood's 22 Panels, which is a famous old thing that's been circulating amongst comics artists for decades. You can find it on Google. Wally Wood's 22 Panels is all about how to handle and make interesting those long, boring conversations that writers just love to throw in. The story is a sci-fi romance set in the not-too-distant future. There are 3 main characters, and they are Emma and Eric, a young couple newly engaged to be married and apparently very much in love, and Jackie, an old girlfriend of Eric's who is now dying from a strange disease in a hospital. Just after he has proposed marriage to Emma, who has been in love with Eric from the moment she first saw him, Eric gets a call from Jackie and learns that she's dying. He goes to the hospital to visit her. She tells him that she still loves him and that the real reason she dumped him 2 years ago is that she knew she was going to die from this disease and didn't want to burden him. Eric never really stopped loving Jackie. All this time he has thought she had dumped him because she didn't love him anymore. He starts spending more and more time with Jackie on the phone. Emma confronts him over this, feeling badly neglected. Eric tells Emma that she isn't really human. She's a comfort robot that he bought 2 years ago to help him to get over Jackie. The end. Sorry to give away the twist ending. It's necessary for you to understand some of the choices I made when I was drawing the pages. And anyway, it will be part of Volume 2 of The Theory, which will be filled with plenty of other stories with equally twisted surprise endings. So without any further ado, let's jump right into the nuts and bolts of the production of two of the pages, pages 3 and 5.
The first thing I did was these character designs. It's crucial to get the look of the characters nailed down at the beginning of the process and keep them kind of in front of you as you're working so that the look of the characters doesn't drift. This is Jackie. She's supposed to be very thin and gaunt because of the disease that she has. And drawing her in profile, I just ghosted her full frontal behind her and then used it as a sort of a guide for the, the level of the ears and the nose. And this is sped up on, from my computer. And there's the final design of Jackie. This is the thumbnail that I made for page 3. It called for 7 panels of different shapes and sizes, and basically what's happening on the page is Eric has just proposed to Emma, and he's putting the ring on her finger in the first panel. She's admiring the ring in the second, and then Eric is opening champagne, pouring it, and they're drinking together. This took about, 90 minutes. Typically, I like to have, when there's multiple panels on a page, one big panel that kind of dominates the page, and it's that bottom panel with Eric and Emma on the sofa together. Now, I did this piece entirely digitally using my Mac and Clip Studio Paint Pro as the art software that I use. It's a very handy software for creating comics. It was originally called Manga Studio. I don't know why they changed the name to Clip Studio. But it's very, very good. And as you can see right there, what I was just using was the subview function. You can load reference images. In this case, I had loaded the character design sketches, and you can use the subview function to look at them while you're working. And now here I'm starting to do the roughs, and I'm using the G Pen tool. If you look on the left, at the very top, you can see I've selected G Pen, which is just a typical kind of serviceable, pen tool. And I'm using, I just picked red to do the roughs in, so that when I finally start inking, I'll be using black, and that way the two colors won't conflict. I'll be able to see very clearly what the ink is, and as opposed to the pencils. And if you look on the right at the menu, the layers palette, you can see I've got a roughs layer, which is what I'm working in, and I've chosen the color orange, this orangish red, so that I can instantly recognize it as the roughs layer. And what I'm doing right now is I'm using the ruler tool to the curve ruler tool to create these nice curving lines for the champagne glasses. This is all sped up, by the way, like 4 times. I'm not actually working this quickly. Using the linear ruler tool, to get that nice straight line on the bottle of champagne there. And here I'm using Google to just get some reference images for a champagne bottle, because I wanted it to look authentic. That's one of the really beautiful things about working, digitally, is you can just find images instantaneously on Google. Back in the day, back in the 90s, when I was first working for DC, artists, this is all pre-computer, nobody had any art software. Photoshop existed, but people didn't use it for drawing comics. And comics pencilers had to keep reference files. They basically had to clip photos out of magazines, newspapers, take photos themselves of, all kinds of things. boats, houses, people, animals, vehicles. Keep them all in separate manila folders, and that way you would just pull out a picture anytime you needed reference. Those days are gone. Now with Google, you can do all this stuff instantaneously and not have to bother too much. Continuing to, do the roughs of Eric. I'm just working over the thumbnails, which are kind of ghosted behind the image in their own layer. And you'll notice that I'm always kind of turning the image. It's easy to do that with Clip Studio. You've got these nifty tools that enable you to zoom in to any amount that you need to or want to. And you can rotate the image, turn it on the diagonal if it's easier for you. You can even flip it to get a mirror image, which is very handy. Again, back in the day, back in the 90s, whenever I was drawing comics, I would always take a penciled page, which I would look at and I would think that it was beautiful, but then I would hold it up to a mirror, and suddenly I could see everything that was wrong with it. Because when you see something reversed in a mirror image, you suddenly see the mistakes that you've made. And the reason for that is just about every one of us is biased either to the left hand or the right hand, depending on if we're left-handed or right-handed. And so things come out looking kind of skewed if you're right-handed. And when you look at them reversed, you can kind of see how they're skewed and make corrections. Now, if you look on the right side there, I'm using the Subview tool with my design sketch of Eric. And I'm using it to guide me in drawing Eric in profile. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, ears are, one of the harder things to learn how to draw, and I kind of view it as a earmark, as it were, of a skilled comics artist, how well he or she can draw ears, because they're so hard to learn. They're these, weird amorphous forms stuck on the side of the head, but, they've got parts just like every other part of the body. And, and look at that. I'm using the selection tool to rotate that part of the thumbnail to make the way he's holding that glass more natural. Now I'm starting on this final big panel, the panel that is kind of dominating the page. And what I'm trying to kind of establish in this panel and on this page in general are that Eric and Emma are really very much in love. They're a couple that have been together for a couple of years, and he's just proposed marriage to her, and it's a happy scene. It's probably the happiest scene in the entire story, because things kind of go downhill from here as Eric learns that his ex, Jackie, is still alive and that she still loves him. And Eric in this story is a very heavy drinker. He's kind of sliding into alcoholism, mainly because of the way he was dumped a couple years ago by Jackie. And so I've got him reaching for the champagne bottle to refill his glass. And here I'm using the curved ruler tool to make a nice, perfect champagne glass. And that's Emma's glass, sitting in the foreground prominently on a table with the champagne inside of it untouched. The reason for that is I kind of decided that since Emma, unbeknownst to herself at this point, is actually an android. She doesn't drink. She doesn't know she's an android, but she doesn't drink or eat. And so Eric has poured her a glass of champagne, kind of ceremoniously and to be polite, but he knows she's not going to drink it, and she has no interest in drinking it. So I've placed it as a matter of, as a composition, design choice, I've placed it prominently in the foreground on the right side of the panel so that your eye is drawn to it. It's just one of those little touches that reinforces what's going on in the story. And this panel is very much a sort of a three-stage. You've got this foreground element, the champagne glass, displayed prominently in the foreground, drawing attention to itself. And then you have Eric and Emma in the middle ground, cuddled up on the sofa, with Eric reaching for the champagne to refill his glass. And Emma is studying her shiny new engagement ring. And in the far background, we've got kind of the rest of the room, and then some big glass windows, and some vegetation outside, bushes or trees. So by using, that kind of three-stage technique, you can create a good sense of depth, spatial depth. And I'm just continuing here to, kind of render Eric's clothes. He's wearing this kind of pullover sweater. It's a turtleneck. There's his hand reaching for that bottle. Now I'm just kind of quickly roughing in the sofa that they're seated on. Just kind of freehanding it. I'm not using the ruler tool or anything. I'm just and now what am I doing now? Yeah, I'm going to use the ruler tools. I wanted to make this kind of really interesting, sort of quasi-futuristic chandelier thing in the kind of in the mid-ground behind Eric and Emma. And I'm using the various ruler tools to create nice straight curving lines. Now I'm using the eraser tool to kind of neaten it up. And the linear ruler tool to make these nice straight lines for the support in the center of it. Okay, now I'm going to start. I kind of decided that this background, the room, needed a little something extra to kind of jazz it up and make it look a little bit more authentic, like a comfortable living room. So I'm just adding, without having put it in the thumbnails, this plant. It's just a spider plant in a big sort of oval vase. So yeah, sometimes when you're doing the roughs after you've done the thumbnails, you'll decide to make additions or subtractions. And I just put this in to punch up the authenticity. Here's the final pencils, all done in red mostly. As you can see in that bottom panel, the big one, I left the rest of the room in the far background kind of unfinished. I decided that I would just handle it in the inks. Yeah. All right, so here I am starting on the inks. First thing I'm going to do is I'm in the roughs layer, and I'm reducing the opacity so that it's just kind of ghosted in. Now I'm starting a new layer and I'm choosing black as its color. So that tells me that it's the inks layer, because the inks layer will of course be done in black. And the tool that I'm using is what's known as the Real G Pen. It's one of the tools that comes with Clip Studio Paint. A lot of people import brushes that they buy online, or they even make their own brushes. I've never done that. I've imported a few different brushes. But I find that the real G Pen is kind of ideal for inking because it mimics very well the quality of line you get when you're using like a Hunts 102 Crow Quill, which was the metal nib that I relied on when I was inking comics for DC back when they were doing everything on paper. Here I'm using the crosshatch tool to create this just kind of interesting effect, and I'm using the droplet spatter tool kind of over it. This is all sped up, remember. This is 4 times. I don't actually work this fast. Using the crosshatch tool and the spatter tool, and now I'm using the eraser tool to neaten it up. And this is just to add visual interest. It's the sort of thing I would have done when I was inking for DC, but it would have been a lot more laborious because you actually had to draw in all the cross-hatching and do the spatter with a toothbrush. Here I've kind of imported a photo of a Moet champagne bottle, and I'm using it as a guide to draw an actual champagne bottle in the cabinet. Yeah, this is one of the handier things about working digitally, is you can do this. Makes things a lot easier in some ways. There are things that are harder, but this is one of the ways in which it's easier. And I'm using the selection and magic wand tool to just knock out areas of black, and now I'm kind of tracing the lettering on the side of the bottle. I'm way into authenticity. You know, it makes a story so much more believable if there's real things in it, things that you encounter in real life. That was one of my big beefs about Youngblood #1, is that it had such a made-up look. Rob Liefeld just drew generic malls, generic cities, generic settings, and none of it looks, you know, believable. It looks like it's Rob Liefeld's idea of a city or a vehicle. Yeah, getting back to the real G Pen, it gives you, when you're working with a steel, you know, Hunts 102 Crow Quill nib or any other Crow Quill nib on Bristol board, which is the kind of paper that comics are typically drawn on when they're done on paper, you get this kind of weird kind of feathering effect where the lines kind of bleed out into the paper in a way that can sometimes be annoying, but it looks very distinctive. And the real G Pen tool in Clip Studio mimics it very well. Yeah. My roughs, as you can see, tend to be pretty tight. You know, inking my own roughs is sometimes really just a matter of kind of tracing them, kind of going over them, but paying more attention to the line weight, you know. It's interesting the lengths to which software companies have gone to mimic the look of real tools, you know, brushes and pens and pencils. Sometimes it makes me wonder, you know, why don't we just use pen and paper? I mean, if you're that concerned about the finished product looking like it was drawn on pen and paper, well, you know, you can just do it on pen and paper. That's a good way to solve the problem. But that's progress for you. It's the modern world that we live in, and there are advantages. There are definitely advantages to working digitally. One of them, of course, is that you can share files instantly. I could email these things to Neil Gibson right away, get his approval or his notes, you know. And when everything was done and approved, I could just transfer the whole thing to him without having to bother with FedEx or going to the post office or anything like that, which is pretty much what you had to do back right up until the early 2000s. starting to ink Emma's face here. Yeah, you've always got to be kind of careful when you're inking like women and children. As I said earlier in this video, for every one line that you add to a woman's face, it tends to add about a year. So less is more, definitely, as a general rule of thumb when you're drawing people that you want to look young. Young women, young men, young children. Unless you've got some kind of really peculiar rendering style like Rob Liefeld, you know, where your drawing is kind of all about this rendering technique, and it's just taken over to such an extent that you can't get away from it. And Rob Liefeld made it work. I mean, his women, you know, they had a bazillion lines on their faces, but they still scanned as young women. It was fine once you kind of get into the practice of viewing his rendering technique and accepting its conventions. Then it all becomes comprehensible and everything, you know, works. Except when it doesn't. Now I'm using the crosshatch tool again because I decided that I wanted to give some cloth-like texture to Eric's shirt. Using the eraser tool to kind of clean it up. But I gave this texture its own layer. If you look over on the right, it's layer 4. It's really important that you keep these layers separate because that way you can change them easily without having to change other layers. And you can adjust them. You can adjust the opacity. You can blur them. You can do all kinds of things. It's one of the harder things, I found at least, that was one of the harder things about learning to work digitally, was just remembering to keep layers separate, learning to really attend to that. It was kind of hard, but it's become second nature to me now. So you can see how quick and easy this is to get this really kind of lovely, kind of believable cloth-like pattern or indication. It's just one of the nifty things, and I've added that kind of funky background, you know, in that one panel to Eric and Emma. Now I'm just sort of starting to go in and freestyle this background behind them in this final last lower big panel, using the linear ruler tool to get these nice straight lines. Eraser tool to neaten them up. Again, they've got their own separate layers so that I can erase those straight lines without erasing the things that I've already drawn. And I've decided that outside there's a guardrail, there's a patio. So I'm just kind of, you know, freehanding in this this guardrail that goes around the perimeter of the patio. I think I'm using just the linear ruler, and I've got my finger on the shift button while I'm doing these lines, and that way they're perfectly vertical if you do that. And just going over the ruler lines. And you can see the rendering I've put on the sofa. Just those little tick marks, just to help indicate solidity and softness. Now I'm going to do something interesting. I'm going to just using a very thin line. I'm going to create this wood pattern on this wall in the background, and I'm just kind of freehanding in these kind of pine wood squiggle lines, which will scan as just wood.
I want to make this a nice, really comfortable sort of rustic room, very inviting and very nice. And so I'm just doing that. And then I switch over to white ink and I continue it in this shadowed area above. And you just get this really kind of neat effect. It looks really real and cool. Just neatening things up. Very important to keep those layers separate so that you can do just this, so that you can erase mistakes on one layer without having to erase things that you like in another. Now I've finished the chandelier. Now I'm using this vegetation tool that comes with Clip Studio, which is very handy for creating these very kind of authentic vegetation effects. So I want there to be plants and stuff outside in the back garden behind these people. And so this is one of the advantages of working with Clip Studio or working digitally in any event. I mean, you can just do these things quickly and get these really cool effects. To do this freehand, old style on paper would have taken a long time. And it would have looked, I don't want to say worse, but it wouldn't have looked as real in some ways. It would have looked more real in the sense of being more drawn. Here's the final inked page. I'm satisfied with it. I'm pretty happy. I kept things very clear, very comprehensible, but I've added all these nice little special effects. So it's cool.
This is the thumbnail of page 5. And in that first panel, I was trying to create a very ominous effect. It's Eric, and he's alone and drinking at night in a darkened room. And this is meant to indicate that he's got some kind of problem in his past that's eating him up. And the rest of the page is meant to reinforce that in spite of his occasional dark moment like that, he and Emma are still very much in love. Emma comforts him, provides companionship, cheers him up, and simply adores him. In that final panel, she's watching him while he's asleep. So here I am starting. I've kind of ghosted in the thumbnail, and I'm starting on a new roughs layer, which again is orange. And I'm just, for some reason I'm doing this panel in blue. But this is in fact the rough. And Neil Gibson, the writer, wanted Eric in this panel to be in a very particular uniform. From one of the theory stories from volume 1, and it's the uniform that you see on the left there. That's a panel that I've kind of just put on top of the image to use as reference. For some reason that I'm not entirely sure about, it was very important that Eric be in that uniform in this particular panel while he's getting drunk, alone at night. I'm kind of roughing in Emma. Emma's in the background. She's observing him. And here I've kind of laid in the earlier character design shots. I just kind of gave them their own layer and put them in there for my own ease instead of having to rely on the sub-view tool, which I told you about a few minutes ago. You can sometimes do this too. You can just kind of lay images in their own layer on whatever you're working on and use them as reference. So that's what I'm doing here. And you might notice that I keep flipping the image horizontally, flipping back and forth between the normal orientation and the mirror view. Sometimes it's just easier to do that. makes for easier drawing, but again, it also makes it easier for you to spot mistakes that you've made because of left or right hand bias. Normally my roughs might not be quite this detailed. I might not be like drawing in the fingernails, for example. But since I did this page, specifically to as part of the instructional content of this channel, I'm really going for broke here and just making some really nice, tight, finished roughs. Now, if I were working with another inker, if I knew that this was going to be inked, by somebody else, then I would definitely make the roughs pretty finished. Because, sometimes you don't want to take any chances, unless it's an inker that you know and trust, and you know you're going to be happy with their decisions. Then you can leave some stuff up to them. When I was working for DC, I worked with some pencilers who were very, very loose and rough. Dennis Cowan comes to mind. His pencils, his roughs were very sketchy. He left a lot of work for the inker to do, which is great because it allowed me as his inker to really kind of spread my artistic wings and flex those muscles and kind of really contribute something, over and above to the art. And then I worked with people like Ethan Van Sciver or Pat Gleason, who were fine enough artists in their own right, but their pencils were so bulletproof and so finished and so clean, and it just left nothing to the imagination, and the process of inking them approximated much more to just an exercise in tracing. Yeah, I'm just continuing on with, here's Emma. She's just to demonstrate how utterly smitten she is with this man, Eric. She's just kind of watching him while he sleeps. Kind of the way, an art connoisseur would sit there in the Louvre looking at the Mona Lisa for hours on end. That's just how she feels. And all this, these pages where we're basically setting up the fact of how in love Emma is with Eric. It's all setting the stage for the big reveal at the end, which is that he doesn't really love her because he can't. A, because he's still in love with his ex Jackie, who dumped him. And B, more importantly, because Emma is actually an android. She isn't human at all. She's programmed to specifically fall in love with and be completely adoring of Eric, but she's basically a toy. And that reveal at the end is kind of tragic, and part of the reason it's tragic is because so much time is spent at the beginning of the story showing how in love she actually is with Eric. It's kind of sad. And here, again, it's another sofa. It might be the same sofa from the previous page. Just kind of going for it and roughing it in freehand, not bothering with the ruler tools. There's no need, after you've drawn a few hundred sofas, you don't really need to use tools. You can just kind of do it. And now this entire scene is going to be blacked out. All those little X's that you see on Eric and that you're going to see on the sofa in a minute, there we go. Those are indicators to me, when I'm inking, that those areas are to be blacked out. They're to be completely black. That is just a convention that I learned in my years working for DC Comics. It's just a comic book artist's convention, a penciler's convention. It's a way of indicating to inkers that they're supposed to put black ink here. I just noticed I went over Eric in this panel with red. I suppose that first blue rough I was doing was kind of a preliminary rough. It was sort of a step one, you know. Same here. I did a preliminary rough of Eric and Emma, but now I'm kind of doing a final rough in red, which has, you know, various little improvements. The entire process of doing the roughs for these pages was probably about, I'd say, maybe 3 hours. It's a little hard to say because I'm a dad, and so it seems like every time I sit down at my drawing board to work, I have to get back up and do something, make dinner, you know, or I don't know, deal with some emotional crisis going on amongst the kids, or, you know, so it's a little hard for me to gauge exactly how long it takes me to do things. Back in the 90s, before I had kids, man, I would put in 12, 14-hour days sometimes. I would start working at 9 in the morning, and with very few breaks, I would keep working, you know, until 2 o'clock at night. And I was just as happy as a clam. But I got a lot of work done. Those were days when I would ink, you know, 2, 3 pages a day. I think my record was in one day I inked like 5 pages, which was, yeah, that's my personal record. Couldn't do that now. Too many other demands in my life. And I just don't know if I'd have the stamina for it anymore anyway. I was much younger and much more hungry back then, as people are when they're first starting out in something like comics or acting, you know. Here again, I'm going over my sort of preliminary rough of Eric and Emma. This is supposed to be a very cuddly scene, you know. They're canoodling on a chair, and it's just a very happy scene. And doing a final red rough of Emma here. You see how I do those eyeballs? It's a very simple recipe, algorithm almost. Just a pupil in the center, a couple of shine indicators, one on the right, one on the left. It just makes those eyes a very, very simple, straightforward way to make eyeballs look very shiny and authentic. This hair that I'm putting over, I've given it its own layer. That way I can just kind of quickly draw it in. And because it's falling over parts of her face, I gave it its own layer. That way I can erase the elements of the face that are covered up without having to worry about erasing the hairlines. If that makes any sense. Layers is a wonderful thing when you're working digitally. Here's the final pencils. That background in panel number 3, as you can see, I left it pretty bare bones. That's one of those things I decided that I would just tackle in the final inks, because it's straightforward enough, and I've drawn things like that enough that I don't really have to bother too much, you know, putting in a lot of work. Now I'm starting to do the inks for page 5, and once again I'm opening a new layer, which will be the dedicated inks layer, and I'm assigning it the color black to remind myself that it is the inks layer. And again, I'm selecting the Real G pen, adjusting my line width to about 12, which is a comfortable line width for inking people when they're in like medium shots. You can see with the Real G pen, you can get these nice feathered lines. And that little line that went off on a tangent there is just a random, computer glitch. Sometimes these things happen. You just have to erase them. Once again, this is sped up. This is 4 times my actual rate of work. I do not work this fast. And here I'm using the magic wand tool to select areas, and I've kind of selected, and then I just use the bucket tool to fill it with black, so it's a real time saver in terms of if you were doing this on paper old school, you'd be just basically sitting there with a brush laboriously filling in the black areas. And again, I'm using the magic wand tool, and boom, instant black. Now I'm going to do something interesting. I've started a new layer, and I'm going to create just this really kind of soft light effect. Just kind of for visual interest. It just sort of jazzes up the page and makes it a little bit lovelier. Just using crosshatch, and adding crosshatch and erasing some of it, adding more, and it just creates this really kind of dense textured effect. And I'm using the droplet spatter tool. And now I'm cleaning it up with my eraser tool. I've said it before, it's just vital to keep those layers separate so that you can erase mistakes or extraneous areas from one layer without erasing the work that you want to keep from another layer. And there we go. Look at that. It's really kind of lovely and just adds visual interest. And now I'm adding a little light glow around Emma in the doorway just to make it look like she's really strongly backlit. Now just starting to ink one of the other panels. You see me kind of reversing taking advantage of the flip feature that Clip Studio has, so that you can change the orientation and get a mirror image. It makes things easier sometimes. I'm going to show you an interesting technique I have for creating perfect eyeballs. I use the figure ruler tool to make a perfect circle, and then I create one eyeball. It's got its own layer. I copy it, paste it, so now I've got 2 perfect eyeballs that I can move around independently of one another, get them in the right position, erase the extraneous bits, and boom. I think I'm moving, just moving one of them. Perfect eyes. I remember in his book, How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, Stan Lee was talking about drawing women's eyes, and he warned against, when you're doing eyelashes, don't draw individual lashes. You always want to treat the eyelashes as a single mass. If you draw individual eyelashes, you get this really kind of creepy, weird effect, and it's just not good. Back in the 1970s and well into the 80s, How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way by Stan Lee and John Buscema was just about the only book out there, the only game in town in terms of kind of a how to draw comics book. And everybody I knew who was into comics and into drawing had a copy. I still have my copy of it to this day. I still consider it the best book there is. There's hundreds of them now, but I still think it's the first, and it's never been surpassed, just in terms of everything you can learn from it. John Buscema was one of the greatest comics artists that ever lived, and Stan Lee, needless to say, is one of the very greatest writers. But I learned a great deal from studying that book. Adding little details of the collar of Emma, give it its own layer so that I can erase the extraneous lines. Just checking to see how it looks. I'm starting on this final panel. Again, it's a little hard for me to gauge exactly how long I worked on this, doing the inks, the digital inks on this page, because it was in a number of sittings, and I, as I said, being a dad, was constantly being called away, but probably about 4 hours, I would say. Which, if you're a professional inker working for Marvel or DC, is about as much time as you want to spend on a page in general. Towards the end of my time working for DC, I was finding that I was spending 10 or 12 hours inking a single page, just because the styles of the pencilers that I was being teamed up with were so dense and so heavy on the detail. Again, guys like Ethan Van Sciver. And it was getting, you shouldn't be spending that much time on a page if you're working for Marvel or DC, but that's just what it took, increasingly to get a job done. It's becoming so labor intensive. Now I'm doing her hair, and I've got it in a separate layer over the black ink layer. And the reason I've done that is so that I can erase the bits of her face that are behind the strands of hair falling down across her face. using the eraser tool to erase those parts. Now I'm using the crosshatch tool to create that same kind of dense textured cloth effect for this blanket that's covering Eric. Using the linear ruler tool to get some nice straight lines for these architectural elements in the background. Using the figure ruler tool to create a nice oval for this wall-mounted lamp that's in the background. And little background details like that. It doesn't really have any aesthetic or functional justification just beyond adding visual interest to the scene. You know, little touches like that help to add to the sense of realism. And the more realistic, the better, as far as I'm concerned. It just, nothing distracts me more than a cheap, made-up looking background. And here I'm using that plant tool again. It's night. It's a night scene outside that window, so I want to have some trees out there, but they're going to be a little muted. And I'm erasing mistakes, but yeah. And now I'm using the spatter tool with white ink to create stars, create a starry sky. And just doing some crosshatch here with black and white ink over that lamp, just to pump up the visual interest and make the scene a little bit more lovely. And there's the final inked page. Again, I'm pretty satisfied with it. It's got this nice kind of spooky opening dominant panel. That sense of mystery and foreboding, followed by the juxtaposition of these lovely panels of Eric and Emma in love. Here's the roughs for page 5, and the pencils superimposed over, and the final inks, just so you can kind of see the process from start to finish. And here's page 3, thumbnails, roughs, and final inks.
Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you found this fun and useful. If you did, please subscribe to this channel, Icon Media EDU, and you can follow me, Prentis Rollins, on Instagram here. And please leave any comments or questions in the comments box below. I look forward to hearing from all of you. Bye for now.